Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Inclusion Cafe. I'm excited about my guest this week. This week, we have Jennifer Thompson. Jennifer, welcome to the cafe.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here.
Now, we're excited to have you here. Today, we're going to be talking about some topics that I know a lot of our listeners is not familiar with. So, I couldn't be more excited. So let's start off by you telling us a little bit about you, who you are, what you're passionate about, kind of what's going on with your life right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you mentioned, my name is Jennifer Thompson. I currently possess a Bachelor of Arts in Communication Studies with a concentration in Organizational Public Relations. Now, I'm also currently working on my Master's in Organizational Public Relations. People ask me all the time, what's the difference between organizational public relations and regular public relations? Short answer of it is it's not political PR. We focus more on organizations, nonprofits, less about politics, more about the organizational standpoint of companies.
The meaningful stuff.
Yes, the meaningful stuff rather than the soul-sucking PR.
Yeah, awesome.
But right now, what I do is first and foremost have to throw a shout out to military veterans, military
Yes.
spouses. I write federal resumes for them. I also currently have my own small business. I'm doing marketing and public relations plans for small businesses. So definitely, if you need those services, reach out to me. But really kind of what sets me up for this podcast is when I was in undergraduate, I studied anthropology. So anthropology and communication studies, obviously a lot about humans. So really that's kind of where my perspectives come from, where my research comes from, the big, anthropology, sociology, psychology, and communication studies.
Yeah, that's amazing. And when we had our introduction kind of chat before, of course, the podcast episode here, hearing all that and that perspective is absolutely what piqued my interest and wanted to have you come on for an episode. And thanks for shouting out the veterans and the work you're doing with spouse resumes and things like that. You and I kind of have our side thing with Begin Within that we're working through. So that's always good to mention. So let's talk about this topic of ethnocentrism.
Got it.
How close did I get to it? Good?
Perfect. Yes.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. And I want to spend probably a good portion of the podcast talking about this because I got to be honest, when you first brought it up on our initial conversation, I found myself in the Google search, right? I was like, okay, what is this? This is pretty deep.
Do I do this?
Yeah, right, exactly. So if you could define this a little bit for our audience, by kind of a general definition, what interests you about it, and yeah, let's just start the conversation there.
Sure, no problem. So ethnocentrism is actually an anthropology terminology. And it refers to when someone believes that their own values, culture, or society are superior over others. And you Google it, that's the simplest, most easy definition for ethnocentrism. Now, I do want to bring up that from my perspective and from my professors and people I've talked to, ethnocentrism has been in America from the second that our forefathers stepped foot onto this continent. European settlers felt that they were more civilized than Native Americans. And, well, we see how that turned out.
Yeah.
So ethnocentrism is really a principle that plagues America even to this day. A lot of my professors brought up that Americans are some of the worst offenders for ethnocentrism. And really that is because ethnocentrism can sometimes be synonymous with patriotism. Now, I want to preface by saying patriotism is a great thing, but in every end of the spectrum, we have people that are extreme on either end of the spectrum. And when I mean ethnocentrism is synonymous with patriotism, I'm talking about radical or, more extremism patriotism.
Yeah. Yeah. I find it fascinating because in the situation that we find ourselves, I guess you could say as a country, right? It's this way or that way, right? We're divided along either a political line, a religious line. So to hear a term like this kind of come up and be defined like that, it gives me a better understanding of kind of maybe how we got here. Does that make
Yeah,
sense? Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. You have to look at how it started and how it's developed over hundreds of years. I mean, we're not super old compared to your Europe's, your Russia, we're not old in comparison to our government.
Yeah.
But from the very first moment, we felt whether it was manifest destiny or, religious betterment for one group, from the very first moment, we said if you're not a participant within our group and our methods and our knowledge, you don't belong here. We're going to either transform you into our beliefs assimilation,
Yeah.
or we're going to kill you off.
Yeah. So does this play out from a culture aspect? Like, I wonder how much of this is just a personality of a group versus the culture of feeling more dominant as a group. Is this a majority kind of mentality? The majority feels like this is kind of where we are and you all kind of have to follow along?
So I think that we're definitely in a pivotal point right now within our lives. And I definitely do want to get into this later on in our podcast with another question that we're going to get into.
Yeah.
But really, we're at kind of this crossroads, and you've been hearing it from other people, not just myself, but we're at this crossroads fundamentally where we really have the opportunity to change our current perspectives and the way we've been doing things. A lot of times people say just because it's not broke, don't fix it, but I think that's the wrong mentality to have. And especially now with people being more included and having a voice and declaring that they want to have a voice, that there is room for us to say, no, this is not how we're going to do it moving forward. And again, you have to be aware of it in the first place before you can even start to do anything about it.
Yeah, I'm going to throw a question, Jennifer, at you and it's not a question I'd kind of put down for us to discuss specifically here, but it's just come up. Well, let me preference this. So I believe inclusion happens through conversation. Like, that's my mantra. Anybody that knows me, what I do, it's all over my LinkedIn profile, my social media profiles, it's in podcast taglines. I mean, it is my jam, right? So how important is conversation in this and navigating this, right? Either for the betterment or worse, right?
Yeah,
Like, I
absolutely.
guess the more specific question is, what types of conversations do we need to be having about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So one principle I do want to bring up that I think is kind of cool along the lines of what can we do about this in the future. It's this new idea of cancel culture. Have you heard of cancel culture?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It's this, oh, I don't agree with what you're saying, so I'm not going to buy in. I'm not going to, all of that. Well, maybe a lot of people see cancel culture as a bad thing, but I personally see it from a PR perspective. I see it as a chance for society to rebrand itself. So, as a society, as many groups of cultures, we are deciding what is acceptable behavior and what is not. Cancel culture really is our opportunity as consumers, with the buying power to determine where our values lie as we reshape the society for the future.
Yeah, I like how you used kind of that marketing and branding to tie all that together. Yeah, that's like a brand statement. I like that.
Absolutely.
I was talking a few days ago with kind of my inner circle around conversation, and I look at it as two types of conversations that we have, either with strangers, families, loved ones, what have you. And it's a conversation to understand something that we're talking about, or it's a conversation to persuade someone else to our way of thinking, our way of belief, so on and so forth. I think we need to have more conversations to understand, because there's a lot of things about us that will never change, because and I don't think this has a lot to do with ethnocentrism, but we're products of our past and our experiences, right? That's how we shape our worldview, our beliefs, and stuff like that. But to stop having the conversation to persuade and having the conversation to understand, we could start understanding things like this term and how we got to where we are. And I just think we would have a better understanding of how to kind of heal and be more inclusive. But we won't
Yeah.
go too philosophical there. I do want to bring us into the workplace because
Yeah,
that's
sure.
something we'd love to focus on here on the Inclusion Cafe. So let's go back to ethnocentrism. Um, and let's take it into the workplace. Is it important for organizations to understand this, and why would they want to kind of invest some time in understanding this philosophy, right? Or is this a
Absolutely.
philosophy? I don't know if it's a philosophy, more of it is a concrete thing.
Yeah, yeah. So it is a little bit more of a concrete thing. It's just a terminology or definition for a group. But yeah, definitely. So what I want to bring up is systems theory, which was actually a principle that was coined in 1974 by Almany. And it states that every person within an organization has a part to play. We're all cogs of the machine. And that company culture is ultimately determined from leadership down. So, if leadership in an organization doesn't value certain decorum or unspoken rules of operation, then the company really will fail to install any sort of transparent, ethical, honest company culture. And really, what I mean by this is that it's fine and dandy if a company has a great mission, value, goal statement. That's great. That's fine. But at the end of the day, it's simply not enough to stand for something when your actions, especially those of leadership, do not match those intentions that are listed in your missions, values, and goals statement. So definitely, I think it's important from an organizational point of view.
Yeah, I think that's great perspective, Jennifer. I think the military works really well because they're bought into the values that each branch has, um, kind of has identified for themselves. What I see, I'm going to this because you mentioned values, is organizations almost cookie cuttering every other organization in their industry.
Yeah.
And a lot of time it has to do with industry, like in automotive, excellence is in like the top 20 values wheels of the top companies, right? Um, Transparency is in the values of your social media companies. That's
Yeah,
odd.
yeah,
But I just
absolutely.
right. It's like they
Cookie
formulate
cutter,
the
like
values before they formulate the culture, and they never change them. They never go back and revisit them. And
absolutely.
and I
So
think that is a huge disconnect. I think
yes,
that values change with the organization, or maybe the values aren't. Maybe the focus on what matters to them means the most. I don't know. Does that make sense?
yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually working on currently a major assignment in one of my organizational leadership communications master's courses. And really, I'm kind of looking at this company, Carnival Cruise Line. I looked at their mission, their goals, their value statements. And then I looked at, their digital media. I looked at their press releases. I looked at their leadership.
Hmm.
And you know what? They said that they value inclusion and diversity, but if you look at their executive leadership board, there's one person of color and two females on a 14-person board, so that again, from a leadership down, if you say that you value diversity and inclusion, you
Yeah.
better show it from leadership.
Yeah. Yeah. And so companies can't get away with stuff like that anymore, right? Because we can
Yeah,
research,
people like me.
right? Yeah. We can research. Everything's online. We see
Yeah,
pictures, we see images, right?
accountability, sure.
Um, One of the points I was going to make is that I think values that companies come up with also are very transactional to the bottom line of, say, profit or revenue. One of
Yeah,
the things, anytime I interview for a company, right, when I go through a job change, I ask, what are your values? right? And I'm not
Yeah.
going to name companies that I've done this with, but there's a very large company that I recently interviewed with, and they have something like 13 leadership principles. And as I read through them, they give you like this packet to prep for an interview. And I read through them, and it was so transactional and cold, right? Like competency, um, dedication. I don't know, but there was nothing around um, culture and appealing to my inner core values like integrity,
Yeah.
loyalty, innovation. Right? I think integrity, inclusion, and innovation should be in every single person, company's values um, in existence across any industry. But my point is, I think that there's such a disconnect in how companies go about creating and formulating their values and how they maintain them, right? And you're
Yeah.
right. When they make these commitments to inclusion, a lot of times they don't think about the optics they're putting out. But the good thing is, and I always credit companies for this and clients, is that you do make the commitment. You're not afraid of it, but you have to get past the commitment and get into the strategies and things like that to create inclusion. So
Absolutely. And, like you were saying, those values and everything, they have become so cookie cutter today. And that's, it's either public relations, you have a public relations team or a communications team that's writing those, or you're going to some sort of organization like the Society of Professional Journalists or the Public Relations Society of America,
yeah.
PRSA, or you're going to nonprofits, society, and you're taking from there, you're looking at their value statements, and those organizations have said, okay, we're at the top of these professionals, these are the values that we have. And even if you look at those, like the Society of Professional Journalism, it hasn't been updated since 2014. And yeah, it says do no harm to others, but it doesn't have any specific section to culture, or and so I think that's really where, like, even from major corporations, major organizations, they're going to these professional associations
Yeah.
to base their company culture, values, mission statements off of, and their resources are already broken to begin with. It just doesn't consider it.
Yeah, so society was at least American society was way different in 2014 than it is today, right? So a startup in 2014 did not face challenges that a startup in 2021. We're in 2021, right? Yes, we are. In 2021 faces. So
Yeah,
I love
absolutely.
this. I love this conversation around values. I could almost do a whole episode with you around this. But let's talk about culture and society, because I think we're probably going to get some good
Yeah,
content here.
sure.
So I believe understanding culture is also a key to creating inclusion, not just in the workplace, but also in society, and not understanding culture as that just culture exists, but diving deep into understanding cultures. Who are the entertainment influencers of this culture that you want to get to know? Who are the political leaders of the culture you want to get to know? And this way of thinking was actually inspired to me from a friend by the name of Ricardo Gonzalez. He does amazing work in learning, mastering culture is what he calls it. So my questions around this are: one, how important do you feel it is to understand culture and understand it deeply? And the first one around workplaces, what impact has the misunderstanding of culture had on companies, organizations, leadership?
Absolutely. So definitely want to get into some definitions first.
Yes.
Not to complicate things, culture really fundamentally is a group that shares values, norms, ideas, behaviors, principles. And then societies are comprised of many cultures or
Mm,
subcultures.
understanding the differences, right, between those two.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Now you can't have society without culture, but it's not the same thing as culture.
Mm,
So, culture can refer to macro, the whole society, like I stated, or in micro terms, and those would be the subcultures. Simply put, a subculture would be a Christian or a Muslim, any type of religious group or there's hundreds of thousands of subgroups in America alone. But I, kind of want to talk about a little bit how I've felt for a while that society in America is kind of sick. We're kind of broken. And I've felt this way since I kind of started doing communication studies and kind of learning how public opinion is shaped, how, marketing has played in a role. And so to get back to cancel culture, I really feel like we've scared some businesses, at least with this, those that depend on keeping up with the contemporary culture, changing with the times. And finally, people are able to kind of see that they have power, they have buying power, they can do call to actions. And we can really take more of an ethical approach to consumption as a society if we decide to. And this really will be determined, like I said, in that we're kind of in that pivotal point right now. And I'm hoping that in the coming days that we will be able to, say that this is not acceptable. Right. We will not buy in to a company that doesn't share our values and goals, how we've shaped them as the society moving forward.
Yeah. I think we're starting to see that, right? Especially over the past, month? I think it would be unheard of for companies to stop giving to political campaigns and things like that based off just the optics around it, right? So, but we're starting to see that now. So maybe that's a shift that we're starting to see, right? In 2020, it was a shift to, okay, we're going to stop checking the box on diversity and inclusion. We're going to start investing in it. We're going to move past the commitment. Right. That's something as a D&I professional that I've seen. And I think most of my colleagues would say as well. But that being said, it's only a select few. Right. And it's more of, I don't want to put an industry on this, but it is some of your more progressive industries, companies, and things like this that are making I guess you could say, the more difficult choices, if that makes sense. But I think the reason is, or what I would hope, it's not from the society kind of pull to do it, but just because they want to get it right and they want to do the right thing. So, but time will tell with that, right?
And that's a business strategy thing. You're either in it for the long haul, and we've seen over the last 10 years how many big box retailers have failed to, change with the times. And now, Sears, unfortunately, I love Sears. They've been doing a hard, having a hard time these last few months and years. And they did really well a long time ago.
So I'm gonna date myself here. I remember going into Blockbuster, right?
Yeah, I remember those. Yeah, I remember them.
And thinking, this is just how you rent movies now. And then if you think about just well, I guess it's been more than a few years, but just the decade or so that's phased out, right? So
yeah,
completely understand.
I do definitely, on the lines of culture, I do definitely want to bring up this idea of it's called humane orientation. Have you ever heard of it?
No. Do tell.
So,
I love all the vocabulary I leave our conversations with. It's like a list of them that I have to go in and research and Google.
I love it. So definitely humane orientation is just one metric to judge different societies. So you've got your America, you got your Mexico, you got your Japan, you've got all of these countries on different scales essentially. And humane orientation is one of them. Humane orientation refers to a scale that's placed over societies to determine the value that said society holds for fairness, altruism, generosity, and the likes. So currently America on this chart sits at 49 points on the humane orientation chart, or the HO chart. But we're still behind other countries like Japan and Finland. Wow. So I think that, like you've been saying all along, starting these conversations, letting people know that, hey, it's not just from our ethnocentric world of America. Other countries are also judging us. You know, scientists are looking at things from a non-emotional standpoint, you know,
Yeah.
a very observational standpoint, and they're rating us as a society, you know, and like I said, humane orientation is just one of those. There's assertiveness orientation, there's all sorts of different scales to measure a society. And I think that really by educating ourselves as to where we sit on these scales, we can determine, do we want to, as a society, be seen as more assertive? Do we want to be seen as more humane? You know, do we want to be seen as more educational focused? And I think really that like having these conversations, like you've been saying all along, starting them and educating people is really the first step and shaping that tomorrow that we're looking to shape.
You know, you just mentioned I'm a big proponent about this, but there's even sometimes in the back of my head, I wonder, I mean, can we really do that? I mean, because we're um, just because we're so different and there's so many different cultures and there's so many, as you said, kind of those subgroups. And um, I'm not a religious person. I used to be, but even if we just take religion alone, separates and divides us into so many different like branches, even within religion, right? So
Yeah.
sometimes I just sit back and I wonder, like, man, can we do that? Can we get there? Because there other
Yeah.
countries do it and do it well. Europe
Yeah.
does. I would imagine they do a little bit better on that benchmark scale than we do, right?
Scandinavian countries,
Yeah,
your more socialistic countries, you know, and socialism is a bad, scary word, but you can still look at a socialistic society and see what they do right and
right.
implement it.
Yeah,
You know, that's one thing that Americans are bad at. I'm sure you will see, you know, you being in your master's and doing research and things like that. American researchers don't generally research with other countries. Everything's proprietary. Everything is safely guarded, hidden secret.
we
And I
came
think
up with
that,
it.
yeah, we came up
Yeah,
with it,
yeah, it's
capitalism, you
ours.
know.
Yeah,
And again, I don't think that any of these systems in place are necessarily bad. I think extreme versions of these systems in place is where, you know, things go wrong. And I love that you brought up Europe, because I do want to bring up the fact that in Europe, you know, they don't necessarily have as much ethnocentrism. And the reason is because you can drive a few hours and be in another country. Now, America is huge. I mean, really big. I've driven across the country a couple times and it's really big, okay? Uh, so, and really our closest neighbors are Canada, who
right.
really, society speaking, are pretty similar to us, other than the
Yeah,
socialism aspect. And then Mexico, and we can kind of see in the last 5 to 10 years how society has treated that other culture.
yes.
So, you know, I think that you're spot on when you say that, you know, Europeans may be more adapted to this idea of culture than we are. We've been sort of in our little bubble for the
Yeah,
last 200 years.
yeah. You know, from I mean, I wonder how we get out of that bubble, right? I mean, what are some of the steps we can take to get out of that bubble? Either from, you know, the well, let's take it back into organizations. You know, what can leaders do, right, to
Yeah.
educate themselves on this whole I'm gonna call it a debacle, right, that we're in. That's I'm gonna let my Northeast Georgia come out here. This pickle we find ourselves in, right? I mean, what do they need to be doing? What do they need to be thinking about? What do they need to be changing?
Yeah,
Yeah, is it?
absolutely.
Yeah.
So I've got a concrete list of
Yes.
suggestions for leadership for you, but I do first want to get into kind of that fragmentation that you were talking about as far as culture and society. If you had asked me the question 5 years ago if we could change society with all of this, you know, separation of ideas and beliefs, I would have said no 5 years ago. But I really feel like when there's any sort of crisis within in American society, at least Americans are really good at buckling down, strapping together, you know, getting over that. And I think
Mhm.
that with the political turmoil that is going on right now, I think that that's holding things up a little bit. But I think that once we start to kind of heal and get past this turmoil that we have right now, I think that, we will be able to say, I'm not just interested in following the groups that I've been interested in. I'm interested in following the groups that are towards a common goal, towards the growth or the accepted values that I hold. And like I said, I really believe that there's this shift in perspective happening, where people are starting to at least, get into the idea. But I really also, I want to get into, for years now, we've been talking about IQ, intelligent quotient. We've also more recently started talking about EQ, emotional intelligence. Yeah. But what people don't know is that there is CQ, which is cultural intelligence.
I've never heard of that. I've never heard of CQ as a term.
Anthropology and communication studies. So I've got 10 suggestions for leadership, as far as how they can start to change and adapt to build their cultural intelligence. The first is respect, recognize, and appreciate cultural differences outside of your own perspectives and experiences.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The second one is constantly possess a curiosity and an interest for learning about other cultures.
That's good.
Next is avoid inappropriate stereotyping or broad generalizations. We do it. We all do it. But, really it's catching yourself. Maybe you make a broad generalization and then after the fact you caught yourself and you said, oh, that was bad of me. Doing that is the first step to removing that from your mentality. You have to be able to do it so many times to break that habit, so to speak. The next suggestion is to adjust personal conceptions of time to show patience. So your personal conception of time and what you've gone through and your experiences are obviously different than my own experiences of time. And so we need to have patience for other people. We cannot allow our own conceptions of time and where we are in time to get in the way of progress. Managing language differences to achieve shared meaning. So in communication studies, we have this huge thing around adapting your language, adapting your communication styles and strategies, your tone, all of that fun stuff, dependent upon the audience that you're talking to. Now, for leadership, and as leadership, you should constantly try to do this as, within that leadership role. You should constantly be trying to tailor each of your chats with your people, with your team, based on their experiences and their perspectives. That's how you are a leader. You're not just someone who's trying to, you're not a boss, you're a leader at that point.
You're having a conversation to understand.
Absolutely. Next, and that jumps right into understand the dimensional aspects of culture. Understand that just because you are part of certain subcultures doesn't mean that, John Smith is part of those same subcultures. He may have completely different experiences, beliefs, etc., just because of his own experiences. And I do want to bring up that, the internet has really allowed for us to, say, no, I don't want to see that information. I don't want to see those messages. I want to be part of this group. And I've got all these other people in this group. I must be right because there's so many people in this group. I think that that's the wrong perspective to kind of have about that. And instead, you really need to understand that there are many, many subcultures, not just those that you participate in.
I think those are phenomenal. And I'm going to have to list all of those out in the description. They were that good.
I've got a couple more.
Oh, good. Keep going. Keep going.
Absolutely. Three more. So the next one is establishing trust and empathy across cross-cultural interactions. Empathy, trust. The next is approach cross-cultural work relationships with a learner mindset. like what you were talking about. And then the last one is build a co-culture of cooperation and innovation. Remember, from a systems theory standpoint, organizational culture comes from leadership down. So from leadership, you have to create a co-culture of cooperation and innovation.
It's almost like this could be a whole branding campaign, marketing campaign around just these alone. It's almost like this is how you fix it. I love those. I think it was around number 3 that you had mentioned. It kept making me think about Ricardo's cultural mastery steps of not just, I don't know if the word identifying with the culture, supporting the culture, or being an ally with the culture or ethnicity, but taking time to learn it. Right. I know when I had an interest to learn Spanish, right? But as I started working through and learning Spanish, I started like uncovering the culture, right? Around the food, the language, the norms, the holidays. I started studying the holidays. I started studying who their political figures were, who their entertainment, like who their J-Lo was and who their Elvis Presley was. And, just who were their favorite movie stars, right? Mine's Daniel Day-Lewis. Well, who do they look at, right? So I love that you kind of put that in there as an awareness that they need to be thinking about their organization from that standpoint, and realizing that, listen, this organization is a melting pot of culture, right?
Absolutely.
But I think a lot of times, and correct me if I'm wrong, I've never been convicted of being the smartest person in the room, but I mean, culture is not just about race and ethnicity, is it?
No.
Right? It's,
no.
I mean,
if you
military veterans are a culture. LGBT
yeah.
community is a culture. Religion, it has its own symbols, languages, norms, all of that, right? But I think we get so caught up on the ethnicity of culture, right? I think we overlook so much.
So I think that really boils down to symbolic interactionism, or kind of how we give meaning to words. One example I like to give to people is I used to be terrified of spiders. And one day a friend told me, he was like, "Oh, why are you afraid of that spider? It's just a silly worm." And I was like, "It's not a worm, it's a spider." And he said, "It's all about how you look at it." So for about 2 weeks, every time I saw a spider, I was living outside doing archaeology, by the way. So every time I saw a spider, I said, "Oh, it's just a silly little worm." And that simple little trick has diffused the scary word of spider to me as a person. I'm not afraid of spiders anymore because they're silly little worms. And I think we put so much value on words, but yet we've had so many different experiences. We have a hard time communicating and having shared meaning because we've had so many different experiences. So we lean on these subcultures. We lean on these shared meanings and these shared experiences because they're comfortable. We're living in a digital world. We're not comfortable with social situations anymore. And so we've clung to these subcultures, these ideals, these beliefs. And I really believe that if there's an aha moment where someone wakes up and says, well, it's just a word. It's just, it's got a different meaning from what I believe than what you believe. And I think that that's really where a lot of that tension, a lot of that struggle stems from, is the fact that we can't properly communicate.
Yeah. I mean, there's things in society that we purposely force ourselves not to talk about: politics, religion, a horrible crime, right? I mean, when's the last time you sit down and had a good, deep conversation about serial killers, right? So it's like, I think we have to get better at communicating. So, so we have a few minutes left here, Jennifer. I want you to share any closing thoughts that you may have around anything we talked about today. Anything you want to share for organizations, leaders who may be listening to the podcast. We covered some what's probably going to be groundbreaking knowledge for the average listener of the podcast. So please, any final insights before we close out?
Absolutely. So have to, of course, make a shout out to organizational public relations. It is a huge passion of mine. I'm sure you could see through this entire podcast. But really, I don't think that marketing, I don't think that organizations, I don't think that a lot of groups of people are taking into account the power that public relations can have on organizations, on public opinion, on the buy-in. And I think that if we really look at it from a PR perspective in the thought of rebranding society, with cancel culture and the likes, I think that, if one person does it, if two people do it, and it grows from there. So I really believe that, if people stop saying, well, I'm just one person, and start using their voice and saying, no, I don't believe in this, I don't stand for this, what do you think? And I think just doing that, is going to spread this out a lot more. We're all stuck at home right now. We are all, living in an internet digital space. We have the opportunity right now to shape society, the values, the cultural understanding. We have that right now.
Mm. Perfect way to close us out. Jennifer, thank you so much for being in the cafe, and amazing conversation.
Absolutely.